Welcome to the Adventures of Brain Injury podcast. I'm Captain Ballister, severe traumatic brain injury survivor and thriver, and I'm here interviewing my good friend Garrett, who's just phenomenal. We had him on the Empowerment series back in 2020 because he is an expert in neurology. He developed the Nuebie device and the creator of Neufit. He also wrote a book called the Neufit Method that's phenomenal. This guy knows his neuroscience, so I'm really excited to talk neuro with you, talk nerdy. Here we go. What's up, Garrett?
Thank you, Kevin. It's great to be here. I'm honored to be on the show, and it's great to catch up with you. It's been a few months since we last spoke, so I'm glad we got to talk a little bit here now, and grateful to be on.
Definitely. Yeah, it's been a little bit. Been traveling around. I'm currently in Florida and gonna be pretty close to USF. I'm pretty close to USF, gonna move even closer. And you were telling me that you had somebody on your show, the Undercurrent podcast, right?
Yeah. So that's our podcast. We're talking all about applying neuroscience in the trenches and daily practice of physical therapy, physical medicine, rehabilitation, across the board, from sports injuries to neurological injuries, neurodegenerative conditions, and then for health and fitness and performance as well. So we're talking to clinicians, we're talking to patients. I'm teaching on different topics, but the guest in that episode was a professor at the University of South Florida who actually conducted the first peer-reviewed scientific research, first published articles that looked at the Nuebie, and specifically they were looking at the effect on muscle hypertrophy. So we basically found that using the Nuebie can create as much muscle recruitment and get as much muscle building effect without lifting any weight at all. So just using the machine can create as much muscle building effect as lifting, like 75 or 80% of one rep max. So like the amount of weight you would lift where you'd be fatigued in, say, 8 or 10 repetitions. So he did that work there. Really, really cool guy who's a professor there named Sam Buckner. And funny fact about him, he actually, I don't know if he still does, at one point at least, he owned the Guinness World Record for doing the most handstand push-ups in some period of time. So cool, really cool guy,
Nice.
A Renaissance man like you.
Nice.
Smart, gift, physically inclined, all of
it. Thank you, man. Yeah. And like you have a pretty you have an awesome story that brought you into all this when you actually saw the benefit of e-stim, and specifically direct current e-stim. Do you want to tell that story a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. So my entry point here was definitely as an athlete and kind of the sports medicine, that injury type of realm. And I grew up playing hockey. I played in college in New England, and I had several injuries along the way. I was always frustrated and disappointed with the approach. It just seemed to me like it didn't quite add up. And when that really became clear is when I saw the opposite. So a lot of great stories are, of course, have an element of adversity. And I had an injury my last, towards the end of my time playing hockey in college. I had some torn ligaments. I was told I was going to have to get surgery. And I thought that would be that until I met another doctor who was doing functional neurology and using older versions of direct current, like more primitive analog, devices. And I worked with him, and in 3 weeks, I was blown away. My ligaments healed. I avoided surgery, and it was so cool to see. This approach of functional neurology, of looking not just at the hardware or the tissues that are damaged, but looking at the software, looking at the nervous system and how the nervous system responds to injury, and how that response actually delays or impedes the healing process, and working at that level, and then using direct current to create these these electric fields that can help orient and align all the cells that control the healing process. Going through that, I was just amazed. I mean, of course, I was grateful, as a early 20s young man. Like, of course, I was grateful to be able to get back out on the ice and not have to get surgery and all that. But what really stood out to me, what really got me excited was that I was also a physics major. I was set to go to graduate school in engineering. And so to find something that actually made sense to me scientifically from first principles, that's where I saw this huge contrast between what I was doing in my previous experiences with injury and traditional physical therapy. So to find something that made sense from first principles, I felt like I was on fire with passion and enthusiasm for this. And I going through that experience, I felt called to share that work with as many people as I could. So, of course, that at the time we're sitting here was 16, 17 years ago or so, so it's been a different journey since then. But yeah, that experience really just ignited this this passion within me, and I was so grateful to have found it, as when I did, even at a relatively young age.
And it's also a really awesome means of application, Yeah, what you've done is really take these neurological concepts and apply them. So that's the other aspect with neurology. And before we were talking about Hebb's postulate, right? Neurons that fire together wire together, and let's see, you also what is it? SAIDs, SAIDs. What is it?
Oh, the
S-A,
SAID principle, yeah,
SAID, yes, SAID.
specific adaptation to imposed demand.
Exactly. Could you explain that and how the Nuebie fits into that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if people are wondering, we mentioned the Nuebie a time or two. This is it right
Right.
here. So it's Nuebie for neuro bioelectric stimulator. It's a direct current as opposed to alternating current, just so you can have a little context for what it is. But that principle is very important. I would say it kind of falls under this umbrella of neuroplasticity. And it's, neuroplasticity is important if we're talking about sports injuries or orthopedic surgery and stuff like that. It's even more important if we're talking about recovering from a traumatic brain injury or spinal cord injury, or trying to restore function after someone lost it, because of MS or other neurodegenerative diseases, people dealing with neuropathy, all these things. So the neuroplasticity describes, I know you talk about it and there's other people who've talked on here, so don't have to go into it other than to say it's how we adapt to the inputs of our environment. So like, one of my favorite ways to describe it is think about a child growing up here in the United States, in Texas where I am, or Florida where you are. They might grow up hearing English or Spanish, and they will naturally come to understand the words of that language. They'll come to hear and speak in the various like accent or dialect and use the intonations of that language. Whereas a child who grows up in China is going to understand and speak with the intonations of Mandarin Chinese, for example. So it's clearly an adaptation to the inputs of the environment. In that case,
Hmm.
specifically what they're hearing on a regular basis. And so we adapt to, specifically to what those inputs are. And that, of course, can be good or bad. If I sit hunched over at a desk all day long, for 8 hours a day, eventually I'm going to adapt to being in that position. I'm going to get so good at it that I will earn the right to stay in that position even when I get up from my desk.
Right.
So neuroplasticity, and there, of course, it's both the nervous system and the signals to keep muscles, but it's also the connective tissues will adapt as well. It's both a software and hardware adaptation. But
Hmm.
neuroplasticity describes how we adapt. And the good news here, and the part that's relevant if we're talking about, brain injury, for example, or trying to restore function, the good news is that, it's not the case that everything is hardwired in. A few decades ago, science used to tell us that, what, once you never rebuild any new neurons, you only have what you have. So if you lose any, you're screwed. You can't get any new ones. We're told that you're basically, after a certain age, you have what you have and you can't really change it. And fortunately, you can teach an old dog new tricks. We've learned that neuroplasticity is possible, and it's especially relevant for people who have neurological injuries or neurodegenerative diseases, because there you have to either stimulate the nervous system to rebuild and repair tissue that's been damaged, or to functionally reorganize, to start using detours, right? Using other pathways in the brain or other areas to complete the same tasks that were originally handled by an area that may have been injured. And so specificity of adaptation tells us that we're going to, as we go through this therapy process and try to help someone harness the power of neuroplasticity in order to improve their function, we want to make sure that the inputs that we're giving are specific to those goals. So like if we're trying to help someone, walk again, sitting around doing hand dexterity exercises is only going to take us so far. At some point, we're going to actually have to work on standing, loading the hips, loading the knees and ankles. We're going to have to work on foot plantar flexion and dorsiflexion, hip flexion, extension, etc. So there's specificity, and very closely related to that is, if we're trying to create neuroplastic change, we need the specificity of the input. We need to be essentially, giving it in the right area. I think there's a good analogy to medication. Like you need to give the right medicine. So in this case, it's the right movement, the right input, the right stimulus in the right area. And you also need to give the right dose when you're talking about medication. And so for us, it's the specific input, and then you need to give it enough times within a session and in enough sessions over time so that you reach this critical mass. Because one interesting part about the brain, talking about these powerful neurological concepts, our brains are oriented toward survival and protection. And so our brains, they don't want to get us to do more. It's quite the opposite. They want us to do less. They want us to conserve energy in case there's going to be a famine tomorrow. They want us to make sure we don't move too far and overstretch and get injured, or move too fast or create too much force and get injured. Because if we're injured, our brains are wired for survival. They're concerned that if we get injured, we might get eaten, right? Our brains evolved during, prior generations, thousands of generations ago. So tens, hundreds of thousands of generations. So our brains want us to do less. And only if they see this input enough times, if it's intense enough and they see it and the brain sees it enough times over a long enough period of time, will the brain get the point that, oh yes, this is actually an important input. We need to pay attention here. This is relevant. We need to adapt, and it is worth investing the energy and resources to make these long-term adaptations, to build up these neurological pathways, and to invest the energy to maintain them over time. You don't just build them once, you have to constantly maintain them. It takes a lot of metabolic activity to fuel nerve conduction, to fuel that communication highway of the body. So there's specificity of adaptation, and there's also the amount.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. Yeah. And I relate with so much of that. Like when you were talking about occupational therapy, basically like what we're doing with our hands when we're trying to walk. So I had my left hand entirely flexed inward, as well as my left toe, pointed down, right? So both completely flexed. And the specific adaptation, or the imposed demand that was done, was really brilliant. What they did is they gave me a brace that would put pressure on my palm, just to lift my wrist a bit, and I would do therapy with that hand, like, still totally flexed inward. And then a week would pass and they'd do a little bit more pressure. Because I would start adapting to that demand. Like, hey, we're going to bring it back this way. And the reason it was flexing to begin with was probably a spinal reflex arc that basically is a stretch reflex we have. That just got confused when my brain got when I bumped my head, it got a little confused and it thought that I needed to be like this. So as we basically showed it that that's okay. Like, you don't need to be doing that. Nothing's being stretched. This is where you want to be. It would change the set point each time, you know? And this also makes me think of the brain kind of being able to call these shots, especially when it comes to pain, you know, and like basically telling you you can't do certain things, but you can do them. Your brain is just trying to survive. So it's saying, don't do that.
Mhm.
And these are some of the things that we see in brain injury a lot, is where the brain has decided that's not okay to do. But your hardware actually is capable of doing whatever it might be. And this is where the Nuebie comes in really powerfully. Do you want to talk about an example of what I'm saying here?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's such an important point, and I love how you're drawing that distinction between the hardware and the software, because we may have, the hardware, of course, being bones, muscles, tendons, ligaments, etc., and they might be capable of, exerting 100 pounds of force in some movement, but the brain might say, you know what, if we go past 50, we might get hurt. And so the brain might limit you at 50. So you try to go to 50 and a half or 51, and the brain says no, and you can't do it, even though the tissues there are capable of it. And that is so common. It's common in even people walking around who don't have any brain injuries, because we learn from bad habits, from incomplete rehabilitation of previous injuries. Are these protective mechanisms that do have value and prevent us from getting hurt, they end up getting set too conservatively. And this is especially true after brain injury or other neurological injury, because there's this dark side of neuroplasticity. We talked about that a little bit. Like if you're in a hunched over position all day, you start to adapt to that. There's a neuroplasticity, is just describes the capacity to adapt. We can adapt in positive or negative directions, and the uh, negative direction, another example of that is learned disuse, where if it becomes difficult to use an area of the body, we end up using it less and less, and that becomes this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy or negative downward spiral, where less activity breeds less activity, which eventually limits, causes the brain to think it's sort of like the elephant who has a leash tied around it with a tree as a
Yes.
baby, where it can't, it thinks that it can't do it, and then it grows and it gets big enough to to pull the tree out easily, and yet it doesn't do it because it's learned that it's incapable of
Right,
moving that
right,
tree.
right.
Is,
And
is
this I want to jump in because this is exactly what happened with my left hand, you know, like I don't want to use my left hand. It's uncoordinated, like a neurological test. You do this as quick as you can. For those who are just watching, I'm basically duck billing my hand together as quick as I can. And then this is as quick as I can do it on my left hand. And it's way slower on my left, and it's even less coordinated and all that. Um, and so I don't really want to use my left that much. But I've, I'm working on kind of forcing myself to use my left more often. One of the one exercise that I did was actually wearing an oven mitt on my right hand, forcing myself to use my left hand way more. And this was something my functional neurologist told me to do, and I gave it a name in a post that I did.
yeah,
Um,
constraint therapy.
Constraint therapy. There you go. Yeah. Yeah. And I did a post called Technology in the Brain. I actually should we should talk and get some Neufit in there because it's really awesome technology for the brain. And that was one simple technology is constraint therapy that actually makes a huge difference in getting us to use the affected limb.
Yeah.
And And that's the thing. What we practice, we get good at. Whether that's practicing something we don't want or practicing something we do want, right? And that's my understanding of negative and positive plasticity is subjective to like what we want. And I say, you know, what's functional and what's not functional. That would be negative and positive. But yeah, you hear practice makes perfect. I had a martial arts instructor that said, no, 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 no. Practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect.
That's
Amen.
right. Another good saying that I've heard is practice makes permanent. So
Yeah, but the thing is, that's not really true either, because we know with neuroscience, nothing's
that's true.
permanent and
Sem
neuroplasticity always happens. So I say,
Semi-permanent.
I semi-permanent. There you go. I say practice makes pathways.
Yeah. Oh, that's even better.
Yeah.
I like that. That is even better. Yeah.
There it
Yeah.
is.
I
That's
like that. I was
Calvinism.
waiting for the word there.
Yeah, there it
That's it.
is.
That's
There
it.
it
That's the
is.
one.
Yeah, so we were talking about physical therapy a bit, and with so as far as therapy, um, how is that useful for how can we use the newbie in physical therapy to or occupational therapy for that matter to improve outcomes?
Yeah, excellent question, and I'll get there. Also, just to close the loop on your last question for like, how this works, a little example or something like that. So we talked about the concept difference between hardware and software. There's so many stories that we see. 90% of people who use the Nuebie notice progress in their first session, and that could be a little bit of more sensation or a little bit of more movement, a little bit looser. Sometimes it's someone who can't lift their arm up, all of a sudden can lift it up. Sometimes it's more dramatic, sometimes less so. But just by way of example, one of the things that one of my favorite stories actually used to start the introduction of my book, and it was about a woman named Amy who had a spinal cord injury, and she was in this learned disuse, dark side of neuroplasticity situation. She could be the poster child for that because she had 25 years before we met. She fell off a horse. She had a spinal cord injury, and she had adapted to life in a wheelchair, and everyone had written off the possibility that she could make any progress now, 25 years after her injury. And she ended up, coming in and working with us. And in the first session, she got a little bit of movement back in her feet, and she had this interesting thing happened where a night or two after the treatment, she actually woke up in the middle of the night and was like, "Oh my gosh, I feel like I can move." And she actually, like, with the help of her hands, she picked up her leg a little bit. But it was the first time she had any movement at all in 25 years. And you think like, okay, what happened there? Obviously, her spinal cord didn't reattach, in response to one treatment, right? But the um, the cool thing that happened there is she actually had a little bit more ability. It was just lying dormant. It was unable to be expressed. Her brain wasn't letting her do it because it learned to think that it wasn't possible. It was like the the large elephant that didn't think it could pull the tree out because it couldn't do it when it was smaller. And so we were able to show her that she could do that and actually make a little bit of progress very quickly. So that was cool. And then to your question about how does this impact the physical therapy process? I mean, one of my favorite ways to describe it is to think about a journey you're trying to take. Say we're going from Texas to Florida, or say you're going from New York City to Los Angeles. So you have that journey. That journey is the equivalent of the amount we talked about. You need a critical mass. You need enough input to drive neuroplastic changes. So there's an amount of work that you have to do. There's not a shortcut. There's an amount of work you have to do. Just like there's a distance that you have to travel to get from New York to Los Angeles. But even though there's a fixed amount that you have to travel, a fixed distance you have to travel, there are different ways that you can make that trip. You could walk, you could ride horseback, right? You could do a horse and buggy, you could take a car, you could also take an airplane. And so there are more or less efficient and more or less safe ways to travel that distance. And what the Nuebie does is allows us to reach that critical mass of input that we need to do it faster. It's the equivalent of taking an airplane instead of driving or walking across the country. And so using this allows us, we need to get hundreds of thousands of repetitions of these specific movement inputs in order to drive change, in order to drive these neurological, neuroplastic adaptations. And this allows us to get, you know, this is not exact, but just for illustration purposes, imagine that every rep that you do is normally one bit of input. Whereas if you do that rep with the machine on, because it's creating this direct current is providing more sensory input into the nervous system and brain. Imagine that each movement now becomes 5 bits of input instead of one. So you're getting every 100 reps that you do, you're getting the equivalent of 500 reps. And so it allows you to reach that distance from New York to California, reach that critical input, that critical threshold, reach that faster, more efficiently, more safely. And another just little related point to that is, sometimes we'll be starting work with someone and we'll tell them that, look, this type of recovery here is going to require that you adopt the mindset of an athlete. You might not think of yourself as an athlete now, but as of from this moment onward, gosh darn it, you are going to think of yourself as an athlete. So an athlete trains, an hour or more every day, or most days. You take a rest day, of course, here and there, uh, but not just a day or a week, but for months at a time, for years on end to adapt to those levels. And that's what it's going to take, and also recover in between sessions. You got to be responsible in what you're doing outside of the office here too. And so we tell people, and they say, well, I understand I have to do hundreds of thousands of reps of a hamstring curl or hip flexion or something like that, but I can't even do one yet. So how am I going to get to 350,000? And the answer is, well, we're going to give this, we're going to give you this input on these pathways as if you're doing the movements. You can start to build those early reps, and then eventually everything else will adapt and catch up, and you'll be able to start doing it, and it will amplify, and we'll get this, positive compounding effect. But it can allow people to get some activity also where they can't generate any, which is a big boost, especially in the beginning if you're trying to start that journey out of New York over across the country. Oh, you're on
Yes,
mute.
absolutely, man. I mean, when I mean, I liken it to basically when yeah, exactly. It's reps. So if you're on this road, like when it's the first road you're gonna do, if you're going through a forest, right? And you need to get from like one side of the forest, like to couple miles away or something, right? You need to go through this whole like forest cross, you know, creeks, like move over, like falling over trees and whatnot. And then you make that trip over and over and over again. And now a pathway is there and it gets easier and easier. And so what the newbie does is basically paves that road way quicker by getting the movement to happen over and over and over and over again, where a groove gets created. And
Practice makes pathways.
yes, it makes exactly. It's practicing really really quickly. It's pretty phenomenal. And I know there's other e-stim devices out there. What I really love about Neufit and the Nuebie is that it's using direct current, whereas like say a TENS unit is using alternating current. And I did a training for the Nuebie for Neufit back in 2020, I think, and might have been 2019. um, and you really drove so many amazing neurological concepts home. um, and let's talk about what happens with alternating current and direct current. Because like when I take a tens unit, it just makes my muscle flex, and
Mhm.
that's it. So why is that? Because the Nuebie doesn't do that.
There's two main categories here, to try to build out an answer. So one is the effect on the hardware of the body, the muscles, bones, connective tissue, nerves, etc. And then the other part of trying to build an answer, the other part is the functional piece of it. And so the functional piece is actually, I think, what we're better known for, and everything. We'll talk about that even longer, but let's touch on make sure I want to make sure I touch on the hardware so I don't forget about it. So the the cool thing about this direct current is that when you have a direct current electric field gradient, it helps to orient all the cells that control the healing and regeneration of these tissues of the body. And so a gradient is like if you have a hill, you look outside and you have a hill and you put a ball on the top of the hill, it'll roll down. That's a gradient of potential energy and gravitational force. So an electric field gradient is the same thing. If you have an electric field, charges in the middle will move, in a certain direction based on that. And so that gradient, that electric field gradient, helps basically orient the cells and optimize their function to accelerate and improve the overall healing process. And we're seeing examples of this, for example, in a study we have going on right now with neuropathy patients, where we're seeing the Nuebie in the experimental group compared to TENS unit in the control group. And we're seeing significant improvements in how effectively the Nuebie and the direct current is able to help those patients literally rebuild, remyelinate their axons, or create new axon collateral sprouting, like literally nerve regeneration and some regrowth there, even in patients in their 60s and 70s when it's been written off that they could make any progress. So there's that issue there, because with alternating current, you don't get you don't get that electric field. You get the charges go back and forth, alternating positive, negative, positive, negative. So you don't get any sustained electric field there in a way that taps into any of this. And so you might be wondering, like, well, knowing that, why do people use alternating current? And the answer is that a lot of these benefits of direct current were known back in the 1960s, 1970s, but there was also one big problem. And that problem is that direct current, if you turn it up to a high enough level to make a difference in these functional and structural domains, if you turn it up to that level, it actually would burn the skin. And so it was a case of the baby being thrown out with the bathwater, where people said, okay, we can't use it because of the burning. So they went to alternating current. And that, is what we have today. We have the TENS units, Russian stim, interferential, FES, NMES, etc. And that there's benefits there, but there's also some limitations. So one of them, of course, is that electric field gradient and the hardware healing side. The functional side, to the point that you made there about you turn on a traditional TENS unit on your arm and it just makes you lock up. That is a big difference, because what's happening there, as that signal goes back and forth, positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative, it sends a signal to your nervous system to contract one side and then the other, one side and then the other. So it's like your bicep and tricep fighting against each other. It's like you're driving your car, hitting the throttle and the brake pedal at the same time. So you're resisting your own movement. And what we can do with direct current is bypass a lot of that, sending a signal in one direction, like the brain, like the nervous system sends naturally. There's one lane of traffic from the brain down to the body, called the southbound lane, and then there's one lane of traffic from the body up to the brain, called that the northbound lane. And so we can tap into, one of those at a time in a way that allows us to activate, a lot of times we choose to activate that northbound lane, sending signals from the body up to the brain. So the brain better knows, more clearly sees what's going on, where that area of the body is, and can better learn to send its own signals down there. But we're able to bypass a lot of that protective co-contraction, and co-contraction being like opposite muscles fighting against each other. We can bypass a lot of that to get this more powerful and more precise message into the nervous system in a way that helps us accelerate that process of neuromuscular reeducation.
So yeah, efferent and afferent signals, northbound and southbound. Um, yes, yes, and neuromuscular re-education. That's us re-educating, and that's happening at the neuromuscular junction. And so all of this is really important for brain injury survivors with physical things, but also this neurology. I mean, the same principles in neuromuscular junctions and our neurology is all governed by the same principles, which is largely what we talked about with neurons that fire together, wire together, Sage's principle, right? And this also comes into our thought patterns and aspects of that sort, where when we continue thinking the same things over and over again, it can be we program that in, and this also happens with pain. I was reading Norman Deutsch, The Brain's Way of Healing, and I think it's Michael Moskowitz or something. Have you heard of
Is that
him,
the
Michael
brain that changes
Moskowitz?
itself?
Yeah, this is the brain's way of healing,
Oh, okay. Is that
which is
a textbook?
another one of
Okay.
his. Yeah, and it's great. And but Michael Moskowitz, basically, he was an anesthesiologist, and he made a boo boo and basically jumped off of a tank, like in a in a junkyard or something, like having fun, and a gas can hook caught his pant leg and like snapped his femur. Like, whoa, talk about pain. My God, that's the biggest bone in the human body, snapped. Um, and he was like, because he was like, an anesthesiologist and stuff, he went from, 10 out of 10 on a pain scale to nothing because the body went into shock. And this is another aspect of like, if the body can go into shock and decide no pain right now, um, there are ways for us to harness that and utilize it as well. And I'd love to talk with you about using the Nuebie for chronic pain, and how and also how chronic pain plasticizes itself or
Mhm.
becomes chronic.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. Just one quick comment. So, of course, neuromuscular education, there are changes at the, neuromuscular junction. And I think there also, can be changes more broadly in all the structures above that are going to be sending signals down to the neuromuscular junction and things like that. And I think even when we're working at the level of the muscle, that input of stimulation can create changes higher up. Just try to close a little loop there, but that's a really good question about chronic pain. So I think it helps to kind of understand the framework for pain here, because pain, we often still think what science was telling us decades ago. We often think that like there's a pain signal here, and if I tap a hot stove or a tack with my fingertip, that triggers pain in my finger, and that pain gets reported up to my brain. I just experience it, but it's coming from here. And we know that now that pain is actually an experience created by the brain. It's a signal that the brain creates as essentially the brain's way of telling us to try to change our behavior. And so there is, something that happens down at the level of the finger that is called nociception, or the perception of threat. And then the brain can receive that along with millions of other bits of information every second. And the brain chooses whether to create a signal of pain or not based on the totality of the inputs at that moment in time. And so there's times where something might happen, but it's only a minor nuisance, compared to something else that's more important. And so the brain may not create a signal of pain in that moment. And that can even go so far as, I mean, like, the example of a broken femur is a dramatic one. There's examples of soldiers, of special operations soldiers that have been shot and not actually noticed because they're so focused on what they're doing, on the current battle or the current situation, and they, until minutes later when they calm down, do they only then realize, like, oh shit, I have a gunshot wound. And so there's the brain will prioritize what is most urgently needed for survival and protection. Sometimes the brain will think, oh, hey, we just rolled our ankle, and we need to create a signal of pain there so that we don't use that and injure it worse. So sometimes there is a one-to-one correlation between pain and damage. But sometimes, especially when we talk about chronic pain, sometimes the pain lingers on even after an injury is already healed, when there's no reason why anything, should hurt. It should, in air quotes, right? And so, there's examples of this where, sometimes people have pain that kind of ebbs and flows, and it's not always related to, like, moving in a particular direction or something like that. So that speaks to some of that, what you talked about, like the plasticity around pain, and how it becomes chronic and how it changes the wiring and things like that. And so there's an interesting phenomenon, the biopsychosocial model of pain, that leads to this metaphor that we call the threat bucket, where we have various threats. Tissue damage could be one of them, but also not sleeping well, or fearing that we might lose the job that we're at right now and lose that source of income. Reactions to food, drinking alcohol. There's all these different things that are stressors on the body, and when that bucket reaches a certain threshold, sometimes the output would be pain. Sometimes the thing that causes us to reach that threshold might be a poor night of sleep, or might be an argument with a significant other, or might be stress at work. And so something that kind of trips the alarm to cause pain, is something that we wouldn't think necessarily causes pain. But it's interesting because when you talk about the plastic changes, I mean, there can be increases in different nerve fiber. Like, over time, people with chronic pain can develop more C fibers, and that sends more of that perception of threat there. But there's this interesting phenomenon where, if your biggest source of stress right now is, risk of losing a job and losing that income and the ability to pay your bills, for example, there's not a, oh my gosh, I might lose my job muscle in the body that your brain can make hurt. So instead, it's going to use an existing pain pathway so that it doesn't have to invest the energy and resources to build a new one. And so that's a big part of why, when people have pain, like, hopefully, if you're listening to this, you don't have pain right now, but if you do, there's a good chance that when you do have it, it often, or perhaps always, is in the same place, or the same one or two places, because sometimes the pain is a response to something else that's not physical, and your brain and your nervous system are going to want to use that well established, well rehearsed pathway. Like you talk about going through the forest, you can try to go through the dense trees, or you can take the the path that someone has already paved over and carved out, right?
Path of least resistance, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Um, you know, we have a lot of physical therapists, occupational therapists, chiropractors, all sorts of practitioners who listen to this podcast as well. And curious where, like, if people want to learn more about Neufit, and for patients as well, where patients would find a practitioner who utilizes this technology. Um, uh, well, yeah, you can go to feedyourbrain.com/Neufit, and I'm on this page. I'm going to be putting a lot of information as far as technology in the brain and aspects like that. But yeah, where can people go to learn more about the Neufit, if they're interested in getting the Nuebie, or if they're interested in using one?
Yeah, great question. And we're happy to, of course, collaborate with you in making that landing page and things like that. But on our website, we have which we'll link to their website, www.new.fit, neu like neurological .fit. We have links or sections for patients and for providers. So if you're a patient, you can go on there. You can certainly read up a little more, and also find a map of physical therapists, chiropractic offices, other medical professionals, other movement professionals that have a device. If there's someone in your area, someone you can go see, we wholeheartedly, enthusiastically encourage you to go see them. If there isn't, or you want to work with us directly, you can reach out to us through the website. We do have a team of physical therapists that do some remote support for people if there isn't anyone nearby, or it's more time or too time or cost prohibitive to go out if you can't arrange transportation or stuff like that. But uh, and then if you're a provider, if you're any sort of clinician and you're interested in potentially using this in your practice, there's a whole link for clinicians with information, talks about the type of training. We have a whole certification program that's included that will share with you some of these powerful neurological principles and how to use the Nuebie and these various strategies to harness the power of neurology and really supercharge daily practice and make these wonderful transformational stories even a more regular thing in your practice.
Nice. That's awesome. Yeah, cool. So I'm gonna have a landing page here. You're gonna find it feedtobrain.com/Neufit. That's NEU like neurology, fit FIT. Um, and yeah, I'd love to build that out. I love how your website's set up to help provide providers and patients both right there. Yeah. Um, where else can people learn more about you? Or is there anything else you want to leave our listeners with?
So if you're on social media, we are definitely most active on Instagram. My few members of our team and I are all on there, posting and interacting and everything. So Instagram it's at Neufit RFP for rehab, fitness, and performance. Neufit RFP, and then we'll invite anyone who's interested to check out my book, The Neufit Method. It's
Totally.
available on Amazon, and put a lot of hours into that one, but I think it does a good job of making a lot of these principles accessible, and we've certainly had good feedback on it. So would love
I love that
to.
book. Like you really spelled out a lot of things and just really if you want to learn about neuroscience, that's a great book.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
I mean,
man.
would say the same thing about your book. I mean, Feed a Brain, we've got several copies, in our clinic over here, just out on display. And I mean, you know, feel the same way about you and your work.
Awesome. Appreciate you, my friend.
Yeah, likewise.
So so good to see you, man. And thank you all for staying here to the end. We will see you next time. Take care.
Bye.
Someone take me to a doctor.